Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. On the 256th day of every year, which inevitably falls in the month of September, we celebrate World Developers Day. It's an occasion for us to stand up and applaud the problem solvers of the world, folks who have used technology to craft the world that we are living in today. As a product which encourages everybody to find their inner developer, this occasion is very special for us and something that we celebrate throughout the month of September. So, to kickstart this year's celebration, we have assembled an elite panel of guests who are experts in their domain, especially around digital transformation, application development, and low code application development, to share their thoughts on the topic low code and the future of software development. So, without any further ado, let me introduce today's panel. First off, we have John Bratincevic, Principal Analyst at Forrester Research, one of the leading technology analyst firms in the world. His area of focus revolves around citizen development, low-code platforms, and application development and digital transformation in general. Before joining Forrester, John was a low-code developer himself and has a lot of experience solving real-life problems with apps developed on low-code platforms. Thank you for joining us today, John. It's a pleasure having you here.
Glad to be here.
Awesome. So next up, we have David Clifford, Chief Strategy Officer at Tectonic Financials. He has over 2 decades of experience in the field of technology and is responsible for all the transformative digital projects at his organization. He has solved some major problems for Tectonic using Creator. So I'm really looking forward for him to share his insights on his experience with low-code application development in this session. Thank you for joining us, David.
Thank you, Trubin.
And next up, we have Tejas Gadhia, who leads everything that has to do anything with the developer products of Zoho. He has been with Zoho for over a decade and works closely with all our major customers to solve their application development problems with a strategic angle to it. Thanks, Tejas. It's good to see you again.
Thanks, Trubin.
All right, and finally, you have me. My name is Trubin, and I lead marketing and customer experience for a bunch of developer products at Zoho. My role today is to moderate the session and be a curious learner as you would be when you are listening to these 3 giants in the industry. So to start off things, we will have John share his findings from his recent research reports on the state of application development and where low-code fits into the whole thing. John, it's all yours.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction, Trubin. As was mentioned, I'm John Bratincevic. I'm a principal analyst at Forrester, and I cover low-code, as was said. And today I'm going to talk about low-code, its significance, some of the major trends in the market with what the vendors are doing to compete and how they're being adopted and how the functionality is evolving. Then there'll be a second section on the changing definition of developer and what a low-code developer is and how to govern them at scale in the real world, because that's a very important topic. And the last section will kind of wrap it all up by pointing to how all these trends impact software sourcing in general, kind of the big impact on how enterprises think about delivering software solutions in their companies. So I want to start with a definition or a question. What's digital? I begin every speech this way. There are a lot of talking heads who talk about digital and digital transformation. Forrester has a definition. Our definition is that digital refers to business models with technology at the core. So whatever the business is, technology is at the center of it. Over time, I've reframed that a different way. I like to say that for a firm to be truly digital, that means that software is an expression of the business. That is, everything about a company, its policies, its processes, its procedures, its data, its know-how, everything about it should be quickly turned into software, which then changes in near real time as the business changes, as continuously improved. That is concretely what being digital in the real world means. Change everything into software and then keep changing it to reflect your business exactly. But how do you do that? Because that's really hard. One reason it's hard is there aren't enough developers to go around. Even with changing economic conditions, this still is absolutely the case. You can look up data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics in North America if you like. You can look to other government entities around the world. The demand for developers far outstrips the supply. So the net result is that developers are hard to find. Ask any enterprise leader and they'll confirm it. And when you can find them, they tend to be expensive and they tend to only want to work on cool things. And that is a very difficult problem to solve. And the net result of this problem and some others is that most companies find themselves in what I'd call a severely undigital condition, where they rely heavily on either analog tools when they shouldn't, or poor analog metaphors. So this is a data point from a survey we do every year, focused on process automation, but it's generally applicable to software in general. And in that survey, we found out that 76% of firms have at least a few paper-based dependencies for their processes. So they're physically passing pieces of paper around, 76%. And 97% of firms have at least a few dependencies on what we call electronic manual routing. So that's basically emailing spreadsheets. This is the natural result of not really understanding what digital is, turn everything into software and change it in real time, right? Either not understanding that, not pursuing it, or even if you know it, not being able to, because you don't have enough developers to do the work, or you don't have the right tools, or whatever it is, right? So we find ourselves in this severely undigital condition. It's not good. These things are invisible, they break, they're fragile, they hold companies back, the whole 9 yards. Not a good thing. We have to overcome this if we want to become digital companies. And as I said, it's a hard problem to solve. This is where low code comes in. So Forrester coined the term low code. So I should tell you our definition for it. Low code platforms are products for making software, but instead of writing code to make that software, hundreds or thousands of lines of code written by a coder, like that box in the upper left there, they provide visual declarative abstractions for making apps. The box in the lower left. So for example, a visual declarative abstraction would be a WYSIWYG canvas where you drag components onto the canvas and resize it, right, instead of writing code for it. Or the ability to notate your business process in a process diagram, and then the engine runs the process for you. So visual, declarative, and doesn't require a coder to do it because you're not writing code. The benefits at this point, I think, are pretty well documented. I don't think anybody really disputes these. One of the primary benefits is speed. When you compare low code to high code development, it's about 60–70% faster on average. It's a good rule of thumb, depending on the use case and the platform. Could be much faster, but that's a conservative number, you can assume. Also, there tends to be a lot of quality checks built into these products. They check dependencies and all sorts of other things. So they make sure what you're building it won't break or hasn't broken something. That not only helps speed, but that helps then the second category, adaptability, which is very important. So being able to change the software you initially made quickly and not break stuff and continue to experiment or innovate or accommodate business conditions or whatever, that's very important. And low code tends to be very adaptable when compared to coding, a lot easier to change what you got. And then finally, the really disruptive thing, when you're not relying on coders cutting code to write software, then non-coders can become developers. So at a minimum, IT shops will use non-developers to write software, like business analysts and things. That's an easy one. But the really disruptive thing is what's called citizen development, when business people outside of IT, often at great scale with thousands of them, are enabled to write apps instead. So it's not just technologists writing apps, it's business people writing apps. And that's a very powerful and disruptive thing, and is very, very important to the market, and one of the key benefits of this category of product. I should also add a bit more on the product definition. Visual and declarative is kind of the core definition, but there is a lot of noise in the market. A lot of vendors will say they're low code for some very discrete thing. And that's not what we track. Doesn't fit our definition. And from what we can tell, that's not how enterprises think about it either, right? Enterprises don't buy in this way. When we talk about low code, we're talking about general purpose platforms for making apps. So there's a full stack of stuff in the box for making web and mobile apps. So you have backend tools for like databases and integration. You have automation tools for long running process and maybe content or some AI stuff. You have front end, of course, so making screens and forms, and generally, there's often specific tools for different channels like mobile development and that kind of thing, and there's reporting, as you would expect. And then underneath that, to go with it, is an underlying SDLC. Some at least basic approach to the DevOps cycle should be included out of the box. So basically what you get is a whole box of components and processes for making software in a visual declarative way. So sometimes I will summarize this as modern development in a box with abstractions. That's basically what low code means in the real world. Those are the products we're talking about. And because of these benefits that I outlined, and the depth of them, like I just said, the features that I just went through, adoption at this point is very mainstream. A few years ago, this number would have been quite a bit lower, especially before COVID. But now, as of our last developer survey that we do every year, the last cycle we did, we asked developers, if their orgs were adopting low code. And as of that cycle, 71% of developers said their firms either had already or plan to adopt low code in the next 12 months. So we're talking about something that's really mainstream, something that's really a first-class option for making apps now. It is no longer kind of in its box on the side for small things. It is a first-class thing for making apps in enterprise. And I want to hammer this point home, by the way. It's first-class in adoption. It's very mainstream, and it's being used for a lot of stuff. That point about it being general purpose is borne out in the data. Here's another data point from that same survey. We asked developers, okay, what kind of apps are you building? And as you can see, we gave them a heck of a lot of options, front end and back end, process, and different sizes and flavors of application. And the percentages are all pretty close together. There's a slight slant to the chart, but not much. A few years ago, there would be more of a slant. It would have been sort of just web and mobile interfaces would have been the top bar, and everything else would have been pretty severely lower. But now, core business applications is right in the middle at 34%, and that's only 4 clicks from the top, which is complete customer-facing applications. So this chart should tell you two things. One is these platforms are genuinely general purpose. They're used for a lot of diverse stuff. These numbers are all pretty close. And two, it isn't just small stuff. Small stuff is included, but no matter how you define core business application, it means non-trivial by definition. So low code is both general purpose in the real world and increasingly used for very important applications, which we see in our other research and our client interactions and so on. I should also point out, this is really interesting. I laid out the benefits, speed, adaptability, and that kind of thing, technical things, economic things. But the number one reason for adopting low code, or the top 2 reasons here, and this aligns very well with our client inquiries as well, not just the data, is that third category of benefit, enabling more people to make apps. So faster is good, higher quality is good, more adaptable is good. But the real driving impulse behind why so many companies are adopting this so quickly is because they want to empower more people, either departmental IT or citizen developers, people outside of IT, to make apps. So the big disruptive benefit is really the thing that people are most interested in. And the rest of it, they just sort of expect comes with the product. Now, I told you that this first section would talk about market trends and segments and what vendors are doing and so on. We haven't presented this in a while in public, so it's good to do. So here are the 4 segments we track at Forrester, and they're all somewhat related, all right? But here's some more nuance to the point about what low code is and how it's developing. So the 2 boxes in the middle are exactly what I said earlier, general purpose low code platforms, which is our primary area of coverage for the category. And I own both of those as an analyst. In this area, we segment by persona. So the reality is out in the real world, even if you have a low code general purpose platform, it isn't necessarily suitable for all people, right? Because sometimes there's more, you need more technical chops and understanding to use them, right? And sometimes they're more tuned for the business person who doesn't know anything technical, right? There's a very, very significant divergence in who can use a given platform based on what problem it's trying to solve. Even if it is general purpose, it can make a lot of stuff, like I said. So we segment by persona. Our first segment in low code is what we call low code for citizen developers. So those are the products that are explicitly aimed at non-technical business people. They're generally engineered from the ground up for that purpose. So they tend to be pretty. They tend to really significantly abstract architecture and make it simple. And their whole goal is to enable people to learn easily and then produce something of value, right? There tends to be a limit on what they can do compared to the professional developer platforms. But the trade-off you're making is they tend to be easier because that's the reason they exist. The next segment is what we call low code for professional developers. And these products are, as you'd expect, aimed more at the professional technologist. It doesn't necessarily mean coders, though coders certainly use them, but someone who at least understands how software comes together, like an analyst, is usually required to develop on these platforms. But what you're getting is they tend to have a lot of depth. They tend to be very suitable for those core critical use cases, like I mentioned earlier. There is some overlap between these 2 segments in the real world, but for the most part, what we found is most vendors have kind of a home base. They've optimized more for functionality and the software persona, or they've optimized more for ease of use, right? So to this point, we segment these categories separately, and there's very little overlap in vendors is what we found. An important related segment is what's called digital process automation. So that's the blue box on the right, okay? So these are companies that typically came out of what used to be called BPM, Business Process Management Solutions. Over time, what we found is that DPA is a core low-code use case, and DPA is becoming more general purpose in its feature set. These segments are actively competing with each other. And the core authoring metaphors are similar. It's always visual and declarative. That's kind of how BPM has always been. So we see these groups increasingly competing with each other, and I'll go through that more in a second. But then the fourth category is what we call collaborative work management. And this is just, it's begun to sneak up in the last few years, but these are basically tools for primarily project and task management as how people think of them, right? Or maybe spreadsheet replacement. But in the real world, enough of them are starting to bake in development tools, so you can make screens, or you can, create little databases or little workflows or whatever. Enough of them snuck in enough development tools that they're basically beginning to cater directly to this low-code citizen developer use case, right? With a very appealing metaphor, often like a spreadsheet metaphor to start. And some of them are starting to bleed into this low-code stuff too. So these are the four segments we track, and we see them increasingly getting in on each other's business, basically, is how the dynamic is shaping up. This is quite a chart, but this shows those four segments. It also throws a couple other motions on there to make the point and show how things are developing. There's a lot of competition and a lot of convergence going on. All right, so we have them neatly segmented. For the time being, they still are fairly accurate, have been for a couple of years. What we see out in the real world is those automation platforms. They all want to be low code. So they're adding more back-end capabilities and better UI tools, right? In addition to their core automation engines, which are so strong and which they've always sold. And they're trying to get more into the low-code business and be that general purpose, adopt the platform and make a bunch of stuff kind of pattern. At the same time, even within our persona segmentation, the professional developer tools, a lot of them are trying to get more into the citizen development opportunity because, as I mentioned, that's the big pot of gold. That's what everybody really wants at the end of the day, right? That's the big transformative thing. So they're trying to simplify their experiences, and they're marketing more to that opportunity. They're saying, hey, we can do citizen development to varying degrees of success. At the same time, all the low-code products, the ones who have been general purpose for a long time and have owned that term, they're becoming automation platforms. Most low-code platforms, especially the professional segment, have added a decent workflow and automation engine into their product, which used to be a totally separate category, like I said. Now it's a feature. So the automation firms are trying to get in the low-code. The low-code firms are getting more into automation, core use case. You may have noticed it on the chart earlier. It was one of the bars. And at the same time, other discrete categories of the stack, things like integration tools, iPaaS or RPA for the client side task automation, things like that, or even BI tools. Many of them now, some of the more prominent vendors, are starting to add other pieces of the stack beyond kind of their core competency and then go to market as a low-code general application development platform. And there's other things I could point to, but those are some of the most significant ones. The point is, there's a handful of related segments. They're all trying to compete with each other, and functionally, it's definitely converging, at least at the basic level. The idea of you buy a platform and it has front end and back end and automation and reporting is becoming a very common concept, and even more diverse categories are trying to basically get into it because of the opportunity it represents and the wide adoption in the market. There's a couple other trends that are worth mentioning. These are two very significant ones. One is, especially among the citizen developer products, okay? Because they tend to sell to more business types who think more in terms of industry and that kind of thing anyway. There's definitely a trend towards industry specialization. So what some of these firms are doing is they have that general purpose product, it's meant for non-technical people to use, but they are either adding templates as kind of a simple thing, but the most mature ones are adding industry specific components, right? Like integrations for certain kinds of systems or machines or whatever. And then pairing that with industry know-how and marketing, consulting partners, basically to say, we're not just a low-code platform, we're a low-code platform for X, manufacturing, right? So it can make whatever you want, but we've got some really good manufacturing magic in there. So part of it is just being competitively defensive, right? So they can not always be thrown in the same pot as everybody else, but also there's high value in it. There's some very interesting case studies where vendors have done this so successfully that they have really disrupted some interesting categories, right? Going to market as a specialized development platform for democratized development. The other significant trend, like virtually every other software category, is this idea of more and more AI being baked into low code. So I don't mean AI being baked into the apps you make. That's one thing. That's been there for many years. Many low-code platforms have connectors and services and all that for putting AI into your app. No, this is AI for helping the developer. So the most obvious example would be many vendors are adding or have added the ability to put a natural language prompt into the development environment, and it will begin to configure the app for you off that prompt, and you can iterate on it in natural language, either for a whole app or for a particular component, or like reporting. Or a little longer lasting example is things like AI assistance to ensure quality or pre-configure something as you're going along. So you're diagramming a process and the platform suggests, do you want this to be the next step configured in this way, right? Based on all the data it's been trained on over the years. So just as in coding and in many other software categories, this idea of AI, whether generative or otherwise, being used to aid the development process is probably the #1 roadmap trend, I would say, among low-code vendors because of the interest in all of software, right? And it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out, because I expect in the short term, one thing I know for sure is it'll increase adoption. It'll increase adoption a lot by business people, because now they can talk to the thing and at least get something out of it, and that will make them motivated to try it and then continue. So that's kind of the market trends and vendor section. The next important section is on what is probably the most common question we get at Forrester on low-code from our clients, which is governance of low-code developers and how to do it in the real world, because it's a very different dynamic than just running a software shop. First off, I want to make this point. What we see going on as low-code is more commonly adopted is that the very definition of a developer and the kind of work they do when low-code is introduced in the mix shifts. Okay, so this is some data from a report we published, I think, last year from that same annual developer survey. We did a bunch of analysis, and in that report, we basically took the professional low-coders. So these aren't the business people in the citizen development thing. These are people in IT or in software groups. Okay, they're professional technologists, but they use low-code. We took them out and we compared them to developers who were what we call high coders, so people who write code. So we had professional low coders, technologists who use low code, and we had professional high coders, people who cut code, and that's how they write software. And we compared them. All right, we wrote a whole report on this. It was very interesting. What we found in that report was that these professional low coders, if you were to sum up their differences to traditional coders, is that they are business focused and they're tech advanced. So for example, they're more likely to wear multiple hats. They're more multidisciplinary. They might be the analyst as well as the tester, as well as the developer, as well as the scrum master. We see this anecdotally, but it was also in the data. They did lots more jobs, right? Because the platform allowed them to do it, because of the efficiency and the tools being baked in. They were more likely to rate business priorities as higher critical. So you gave them a list of business priorities. They were way more likely to say, yeah, we care about driving revenue. We care about improving customer experience. We care about whatever, right? Business goals, not technical ones. In terms of their personality and what they cared about those things. Also, their teams were measured that way. They were much more likely than coders to have their teams measured by the business impact of the software they made. So not how many story points you created or whatever, but are delivered or whatever, but like, hey, did our app save money? Hey, did our app improve customer experience, as I mentioned? That they were much more likely to have their team actually measured on those things. And then finally, the real kicker here is you could kind of intuit those, like, okay, yeah, there's like this more business-like person would use low code and da-da-da-da. The real kicker is that these same people were also much more likely to be working on what we call advanced use cases. So cool technical stuff, newish stuff. So like they're much more likely to be writing IoT apps. They're much more likely to be using container orchestration. They were much more likely to be building apps on microservices or building microservices, which if you know anything about that, that's pretty complex, etc. So they weren't just business focused, they were also ahead of their coder colleagues when it came to kind of a lot of the cool stuff, right? And to me, this shows how the low coder is actually sort of the ideal engineer. We've said this for years in development, like we want people who know various things and they care more about the business impact, and it's just hard to do, right? But it's happening in low code. Those are the kind of people that use it. That's how those teams actually run. So if you lay out that idea of the professional low coder becoming more business focused and more multidisciplinary, as well as doing tech advanced stuff. So professional technologists use low code end up being that way. And then you layer in this mega trend, which I mentioned already, which is driving so much adoption, which is, well, let's get business people developing outside of IT, right? What you see is from both sides of the spectrum, we're pushing towards the middle. We're pushing towards this idea of the low code developer is basically the business first, multidisciplinary digital problem solver. So whether they come from business and they're learning technology and they're adding that to their skill set, or whether they come from technology and now they're using this tool set and coming up with all these new techniques and ways of working and new use cases because of it, it's pushing towards this idea of the engineer who can do multiple things to deliver a solution, not just one discrete technical task. And there's a lot of them out there, and they're using low code. And that's a very cool, disruptive thing. So then you get to, okay, well, that's great. I love this idea of citizen development. I want to unleash these armies of innovation. I love this idea that the technologists are becoming more focused on business outcomes and are doing cool, advanced stuff because of the low code and all this, and they're working together and all that. But how do you govern this? Because what you're talking about is potentially hundreds or thousands of developers working together on hundreds or thousands of apps. right? That's how it actually plays out in the real world, is you go around and pursue digital and digitize the heck out of everything and make all this stuff and work in these different ways. And it's a lot of new work, and it's very different than the old way of delivering software. So we found when it comes to governing citizen development and democratized development and putting these different developers together over time, we found that there's 3 common org governance models that enterprises are using. I'm actually going to skip the first 2. We have a whole report on it if you want to read on it. But what I have come to over the last few years is that number 3 is basically where most of the big companies are going. So that's the one I want to focus on. And that structure is called the federation. It is a very, I think of it as a pretty intuitive structure, but you got to do it, right? You got to go do it if you want to be successful here. It starts with the concept of a COE, all right? Whatever it's called different things, but a team that's responsible for running the strategy and scaling it, enabling people to develop. That COE over time enables departmental champions, or maybe they're called evangelists or whatever they are. They start fermenting these different people around the company, volunteers, who then kind of form these communities. So there's another layer between them running the strategy and helping set up the platform and all that. There's another layer that's kind of spread out throughout the company that can help people. And then down at the bottom is anybody. Anybody in a company can go develop an app in one of these very mature, federated citizen developer environments. And the key to doing this effectively is not only do you have to have, a COE that actually delivers apps and knows how software works, doesn't just make rules, but when you are pursuing a structure at this scale and with these ambitions, you have to start distinguishing between use cases. And that's one of the keys. You have to start looking at all the work these people are doing and all the apps they're making and start saying not all apps are created equal, and we have to segment them somehow. And that's a different motion for a software shop, right? Where everything just goes through a set SDLC and we do it how we do it. Scaling to this level and having this kind of organization support it requires then, okay, there's a lot of software work happening now in this big, beautiful, happy family. How do we distinguish between the different kinds of apps and manage them differently, right? And that requires this sort of thing. This is another, I think of it as a very intuitive, but it's very real. This is what people are doing, getting results, way of managing this opportunity. It's use case classification. So the most common scheme is something like this, where there's 3 zones. And the idea is you want to balance risk. You want to balance risk of any given application that someone might be making on one of these platforms. And depending on its risk profile, and you come up with the different factors for what determines the risk, you put it in a different category and you treat it with a different SDLC. So category 1 in general is meant to be the autonomous citizen developer category. So any business person in the company can go out and autonomously deliver an application. Applications in that category, it's fine, go ahead, we don't care. The potential blowback or harm from that is very low. Right, I'll get into an example of what that might be in a second. The second category is, well, okay, it is appropriate for citizen development, but something more is required. It's not just you go take care of it and the COE or the governance structure doesn't care. Typically, something will be involved like having a code review, even if they're not looking at code, that's just the term people use, or having an approval before there's a deployment, or working with someone to make sure you have test cases, because in this particular case, having a formal testing plan makes sense, or defining long-term who's going to support this application, right? Because it's significant enough that you can make it, you can own it, but maybe we need some formal support from somebody to make sure this thing lasts or whatever, right? And there's different levers that happen. But the point is, it's business person can own and deliver it. It's appropriate for citizen development, but something more is required. And that something can vary by company. And there can be different categories or something. And then finally is, the don't do it, the off limits. That is an application that really should not be built by a decentralized, maybe non-technical person, right? And something like that would be a big core system that the entire company uses. That would be pretty typical. That's something that a shared service would build and protect carefully, as you'd expect. So here's an example of an actual company, one of the largest companies in the world, that did exactly this. They went through and they executed on a citizen developer strategy, and they scaled it to about, I think they've trained 6,000 or 7,000 people last time I spoke to them, and I think 4,000 or 5,000 of them had already developed apps, right? So the majority of them were delivering value. And this was how they did their use case classification. So as you can see, if you were to simplify it, there's a lot of factors on here, but there was the green zone. That was the go ahead and build it, we don't care, right? And their threshold for that, and I'm not saying this is the right threshold, I'm just saying that's what they chose. I've heard opposite opinions, right? But it's a fine one, was internal apps up to 50 users. So it was an application that was only internal, and it was no more than 50 users. That was the risk proxy. That was the determining one primarily. Then that was the green zone. You have access to the platform, go make it. It's for your department or business unit, whatever, we don't care, right? And it doesn't have any like sensitive data or anything. That was the other thing. Their yellow zone was, well, okay, maybe it's external facing, B2B. They didn't allow B2C, but like, dealing with partners or vendors or whatever. There's some degree of integration that's higher, right? It's not really defined in this chart, but it's more complex, and because complexity is a risk factor, right? Like, because you might mess something up, right? And then somebody else will have to fix it. Maybe the data was a little more confidential, you can see there, or what have you, right? So this is the idea of, it's not that we don't want you to build significant apps, but if it trips these levers, then we want you to work with a coach. They had that federated structure that had the decentralized coaches in the communities of practice to support anybody who wanted to make an app. So the way the structure worked was, when you went into that zone, a coach had to work with you and determine, do you need a formal test plan? Do you need formal support from IT for the app to finish it or whatever, or support it ongoing or whatever, right? That was how they dealt with it. And then the third category was, don't do it. Right? It's not a citizen developer project. So those were B2C apps, applications with big implications for compliance, like accounting things or whatever, etc. Right? Gigantic core applications. And even if it was your idea and you ended up working in the team that delivered it, you didn't own it. That was owned by the professionals in a centralized way. So again, this is based on a real case study. It's published on the Forrester website. You can look it up, and people are doing it. This isn't theory anymore. A few years ago, it was like, wouldn't it be nice if thousands of business people were building apps? We'd probably get some value out of that. It's happening. There are dozens of examples of it now. There's immense ROIs, but it all starts with, okay, we want to enable a lot of people. We got to manage risk, but not all apps are treated the same way. So here's a good concrete example of how you can manage that. Here then is my point. One of the points I want you to leave with on this topic, which is, that's all great. It's working, but here's one thing that's missing. And that is, whether it's in the low-code platforms themselves, or it's in third-party vendors or custom development or whatever that augments the strategy. All those governance factors, the business rules around how the processes work, the different SDLCs, the different things determining what zone an application is in and how to infer it and treat it differently and all that, that needs to be digitized. Just like anything else to be digital, the governance stuff needs to be digitized too. Think of it as like DevOps for citizen development. We're starting to kind of write about it that way. So all the policies around citizen development for governance, all the standards for building apps, and then the SDLC processes, those have to be built into the thing. So when the metadata says the application is of this size or this risk profile, the platform or the product or the custom development itself says, okay, this SDLC, okay, this review, okay, this test case is required. Oh, this app has grown to this size. It has to be reviewed by somebody, and now it has to have a certain level of support or whatever, right? We've scaled to a certain point with a tiny bit of automation and a lot of hard work, right? Like the example I gave you before, but where the industry needs to go now to get to the 50,000 person mark, I don't know of any like that, but a lot of them are trying, is to do more of this. So the vendors need to step up to do this. I know a lot of them are working on that. And also the end users themselves that are using these products, they need to think this way, and they need to demand those features, or they need to roll their own if they're ambitious. And I've been beating this drum for a couple of years, and I am now starting to see it actually happen in the market, which is very encouraging. All right, so what does all this mean? I've gone through the benefits of low code in general, the impacts, how they're used, the fact that they're general purpose, and they're used for both small things, but also increasingly lots of critical things. The impact of low code on how developers themselves work and what they do, the professional developer and how they're developing, and how there's these citizen developer programs, and they're scaling them and they're governing them and they're working together and all this. What does all that mean? Is it just, well, we can make more apps? Well, it means that the boundary between build and buy is blurring massively. That's what it means. It means that when all these things are true, the algebra for whether you build or buy a given software solution is very, very different, because low code changes the economics and the delivery mechanism and the whole mindset around what software is and how it should work. Our assertion right now then, because of the again, the economics of being able to deliver so much cheaply, 67, 80, 90% cheaper and faster, lots more people being able to develop, a much more multidisciplinary development, et cetera. Our assertion in that context is that low code and other technologies like it have affected the decision-making process such that for any given enterprise, it's no longer build versus buy. It's no longer, do I build something from scratch in code or buy a vanilla solution off the shelf? To be really digital, you're going to need bespoke no matter what you do, right? Because that requires digitizing everything all the time. Low code allows you to do it. So your real decision is, I can either take something off the shelf and customize it. So I should start with something that's architected for change, like maybe built on a low code platform or whatever. That's one end of the spectrum, right? Don't assume vanilla. Vanilla doesn't work in the real world. That flies in the face of digital. You're going to have to do a ton of bespoke development. So if you want to start with something off the shelf, you're going to have to get something that's meant to change, customize, by design, or you're going to have to compose it. That's the other side of the spectrum. It's not pure build. It's not dipping into the primordial soup of code and having developers write 10,000 lines of codes for everything. That's basically dead. Not coding is dead, but that reflexive reaction to every custom solution requires a coder. It's just not true. You can compose it now to a high degree of quality, as I keep saying, using things like low code. And between those 2 points is basically a spectrum of solutions all around this idea of there's a different economics around development, and we have to become digital. We have to reflexively digitize everything and change it as the business needs to changes, which means everybody at the end of the day is much more bespoke than the traditional enterprise assumptions would imply. And our call on this, and has been for a while, and we just keep seeing it play out in the real world, is that the pendulum is swinging. Not only the choices change, build versus buy is a bad way to think about it, it's customize or compose, but we're swinging more towards compose. We're swinging more towards bespoke development as the better option because of the economics and the need to be digital, as I keep saying. You can see it most clearly in customer-facing applications, things like e-commerce is a really obvious one. Like there's no off-the-shelf e-commerce project in the world anymore. It's all very bespoke. And it makes sense because you're removing friction from the buy path and differentiating and driving revenue and all that. But the moment you get into customer operations, it's the same thing. All the back office stuff that supports and impacts the customer, that's all very unique if you're going to digitize it all, right? Unless you're going to have all those analog workarounds, then use some vanilla version from another system of a process. Like you need to kind of consistently keep developing that. So that's very bespoke as well. You're going to be composing it. And then what we've also found is even core business records or core applications, like back-end core applications. You think of those as kind of sacred and off limits, but what we find is these companies often find themselves needing to change them, which means you're going to have to customize them. Right? Or nothing is really sacred anymore. So that's our view, is that everything's swinging very much towards the bespoke side of the spectrum in order to enable digital business. And in this context, there are 5 pragmatic solutions for modern delivery, and I won't go through them all. The point is that low code is one of them. It's sort of the Goldilocks in the middle because of all the economic benefits I mentioned, because of expanding the developer pool, etc. And there's an excellent case study on this. So it isn't all just theory. This is an example of a global luxury goods manufacturer, so manufacturing company. They bought a manufacturing execution system that was one of the best on the market. That was their words. They tried to roll it out for 3 years and then got rid of it. Why? Because they couldn't change it. Because even though it was great software, they wanted to continuously improve their manufacturing processes. They wanted the software to be how their factories worked and then improve it. And they couldn't. The software worked the way it worked. So they got rid of it, lost all that money. They bought a low-code platform instead that was tailored to their industry. It was aimed at manufacturing and had integrations for different IoT devices and machines and so on, in addition to all the basic components. And they empowered their process engineers and their recent college graduates, their continuous improvement coordinators, they call them, that they put them out on the floor to learn the business. They wrote the custom manufacturing execution software instead. When I spoke to them, the system they wrote across all the plants, all these different people working on it, was about 45 individual applications running about 1 million transactions a month, which the kind of stuff they sell, that's a lot of transactions. And it had all these advanced features, as you'd expect. There were like IoT devices running and dashboards running and widgets being made. And there were machine interfaces with the machines people were using and so on. And the net result is it was better and faster and cheaper. The licensing cost was like a tiny fraction of that off-the-shelf solution. They also, interestingly, got to the point where they wrote some custom scripts for DevOps governance to ensure there's certain design standards were met. And they're at the point where it's been such a wild success for them, this big democratized rollout of a core system. All these plants are now little software factories, and they're trying to roll it out, this same platform, out to their suppliers. So they got so much value out of it, they want that value to go to their suppliers so they can then get the supplies, the value as they pull it through. So this is a really interesting case study because it demonstrates a bunch of the trends I mentioned. It demonstrates basically low-code's impact on build versus buy, right, where they compose the solution instead. It demonstrates industry specialization. This was a vendor that had specialized components for the industry. That's why they bought it and why, one of the reasons it worked so well. And it demonstrates a democratized implementation. These weren't the software engineers making the system. These were the people on the plant floors who knew how the thing worked. And also it gets a little bit into that desire and need for automated governance because they started using kind of DevOps techniques to automate some of the things that were needed to govern democratized development. So it's very, very interesting. My view is that I think a lot of the software world is going to start looking like this story over time. So in that context, what are our recommendations? The first one I hope is pretty obvious. We recommend this to pretty much every client. You should have a low-code platform. It's table stakes at this point. If you don't, you should get one. Second is you should seriously consider Compose, using low code and some other technologies that are similar, as a key option in any software sourcing decision. So don't just reflexively buy an app because that's how you've always done it. You just presume that'll be easier and better. It's not the case anymore. If you want to be digital, you need it to be exactly what your business is at any given time. So if you're going to buy an app, make sure it's something that can change and is modern and is a price you're willing to pay. Otherwise, strongly consider Compose with low code. It's a very viable option, as I keep emphasizing, and it's one of the keys to being digital, is using things like this. Also, you're going to have to find more developers. Like, you're just going to have to. And one way to do that is federating, democratizing development. As I keep mentioning, that's the overwhelming trend, is allowing business people to develop and then working together as this big happy family. And you should definitely do that. It's hard, but it's worth it. There's high value. Also, what we've observed that when you do this, there's a continuous improvement culture that tends to happen. And our suggestion is to pursue that consciously, right? Use these platforms to drive that collaboration and the people working together on the thing to make the thing and all that. And view it as that, not simply as an economic exercise, but as a mechanism to get people working together in software and thinking digitally. And finally, the whole point of this is to be digital, which means use low code and other tools, but low code, to express the business in software, to ubiquitously digitize everything about a firm and change it in real time. As I keep saying, in our view, low code is one of the most practical ways to do that. So with that, we'll wrap.
All right. So thanks a lot, John, for all that insight. For me personally, software as an expression of business, convergence of platforms, how different developer personas are coming together to solve problems. And finally, the blurring boundaries between build and buy. Those are my key takeaways. Let me bring in David and Tejas into the discussion and start off, right? So David, I'll probably kick it off with you. John gave us the entire insights on how the industry is shaping up and how organizations are going about or should go about application development, right? You are on the other side of the spectrum. Can you tell us on how you started your low-code journey, what led you to Creator, and some of the key projects that I personally know you have worked on, but shed some light on that?
Oh, absolutely. Thanks, Tribune. And excellent presentation, John. Really good. So I'm employed by Tectonic Financial. So we're a NASDAQ traded financial services firm. We have at the core of our business a bank, and it's T-Bank based in Dallas. And then we have a series of other financial services businesses like insurance companies and wealth management firms, investment advisory. And what I recognized early on was that we have to have, there's a core piece of technology in each one of our businesses that, as much as we would like to replace it, we're probably going to be stuck with it. Like a bank core, for example. You're not going to replace a bank core with a custom piece of software unless you're a JP Morgan or somebody really big, which we're not. But what we recognized was with a low code platform, we could build around that core infrastructure and build things like customer portals and workflow tools, and we could sync data so that we had a comprehensive view of a customer. So we started exploring this back in 2019, and I looked at a series of platforms back then, and I chose Zoho. And the reason I chose Zoho at the time, which was quite fortunate, was it was the platform that I think best met me and our organization where we were. So, and what I've come to find over time with the Zoho platform is it is really capable of kind of spreading. John had a chart there where he talked about the different types of low code platforms and development. And the Zoho One platform with Creator at the core of that covers a broad spectrum, multiple categories with the multiple low code categories. I'm not a developer, so I wasn't going to get in there and start, coding directly into an application. But I realized with Creator I could build some things, and so we built some customer-facing applications to start with. But then the pandemic hit, and when it hit, we had to put together a loan origination platform for the PPP program overnight. And so in a span of a couple weeks, we were able to, with an external development partner, spin up a platform that, where we ended up servicing over, I guess it was almost 2,000 customers and doing over $100 million of loan origination for our small business, right? Where that just absolutely wouldn't have been possible without a low code platform that where we could put something together very quickly and securely. And that convinced us of the value of low code. And since then, we actually have multiple low code platforms that we use today. I still prefer Zoho. I think it's the one that has the most, and I'll go on the record as being a Zoho fanboy. There might not be many of them, but I'm in that category. The Zoho does a really good job of allowing you to build a variety, something very simple that would fit that almost citizen category, not even the citizen developer. And then we have a team of people we have hired and are adding to that literally code all day long. They code in Deluge script, which is Zoho's coding language, but we can build pretty much anything that we want to build on that platform. There are some things that we use a different platform for, but I would say overall it's been very helpful for us in that digital transformation that John was talking about.
Sweet. Thanks a lot for that, David. And for those who are not aware of what a PPP is, it's a paycheck protection plan that was a part of the CARE Act, which was a COVID relief act that was essentially it supported small businesses with federally backed loans to survive through the phase of COVID where we were absolutely uncertain on how the economy is going and how businesses were going to survive, right? So it was very different. The loan disbursement was very different from what was followed traditionally, and that is why there was a need to add a custom loan origination platform to Tectonic's backend. So that's a bit of information for those who are not aware of what PPP is and how or why it was required, right? Thanks, David. Tejas, I'll come to you, right? We have heard from John on the industry side of things. We have heard from David on how he went about using low-code platforms. But then I know there is a large story in terms of the work that goes into building a platform like Creator, building a low-code platform, right? So can you share that journey? And you have been with Zoho for about 12 years, I think now. So you've been there for the major part of how Creator has evolved, or you have seen that bit. So can you share some light on what goes into building a platform like Creator?
Yeah, good question. So I think John's slide on the different types of governance structures of an organization is extremely important, because to make features that people use to build tables and visuals and reports and analytics and things like that, I would say those are kind of all table stakes, and a lot of vendors kind of do it in different variables. But actually designing for the organization to have a successful implementation has kind of become, I would say, pretty core in the X factor. When we started out, we were definitely in the free-for-all model. Everybody sign up for an account, build whatever you want to, very minimal oversight or management, build whatever integrations, have access to whatever data. I guess partially because we targeted smaller companies at that point, so there wasn't really that many levels of IT and COEs and stuff like that. But at the same time, we basically just found that there's a lot of organizations that start out trying to build a good low-code strategy and then fail, not because the tool doesn't do the right kind of formula or doesn't have the right kind of report type. It's really because the governance structures in place don't let people do what they need to do and also protect the information, customer information, privacy, compliance, governance, whatever, in the right kinds of formats. And so kind of shifting our mindset a little bit to be more along the lines of the users that are building apps, the types of people who are provisioning apps, and the types of people that are overseeing the entire platform. What are the tools that these guys need to be able to have a successful implementation? And then at the same time, it's not like we're not coming up with new features and making the platform easier to use. I think after a long time, it becomes, before we were adding a lot more features to make the platform a lot more complex. Now we're making a lot more features to simplify a lot of those complex features we added. to make sure that everything we roll out has a simple version that anybody can use, intermediate version, someone with a little bit of experience, maybe a year to 3 years of creator or any kind of like technical experience. And then also that same feature can be extended even further. Like David was mentioning, we can hire people who can extend it and build something extremely complicated through different programming languages or different types of just advanced functionality.
Thanks a lot for that, Tejas. Thank you very much. David, one final question to you before I kind of shoot my close the discussion with a question to John. So to you, you mentioned about everything that you have built on Creator, on low code. How has that changed with the overall development strategy that you have? And what are some of the key projects that is work in progress right now that you are preferring to build on Creator, whichever you can share with us?
Sure. Yeah. So I would say we have about a dozen applications now across our business that are on the Zoho Creator platform. We have another couple of applications that we've built on another low-code platform. So I would say that in the next few years, every single aspect of our business will be touched by low-code. The core project we're working on right now is a loan origination platform. It's an extension of what we did with the PPP program that you had described earlier. That's been a real big success with our business development officers. Gives us a way to collect data and information from borrowers. I think to the point that you guys were making earlier, both Tejas and John, governance is really important, especially if you're a bank. So we're OCC regulated, and the regulators come in and they look at our infrastructure, and Zoho isn't necessarily a name that they would associate with enterprise software necessarily, but Zoho actually has, and this is another kind of well-kept secret, is they have environments and they have the developer infrastructure where you can do staging and the various components or phases of development. So I would say we're going to be building applications nonstop on these low-code platforms for the foreseeable future.
Sweet. So
One quick thing, Trivit, David, the first time we met, you had told me about like when you started that PPP app, and you said that you went through like a couple thousand loans or whatever. What was like how long was it taking to do loans, or how many were you doing a day, month, week, whatever, to like post app? Like, was there actual like productivity gains, or was it just a structure for collecting information, or a combination of the two?
Well, it was a great story because it was just something that we couldn't have done it in paper, right? So the regulation was coming out by the minute on those programs. And so the CEO was like, I want something operational immediately that will allow us to take in these loans. And so I'm not exaggerating when I say that in a span of a couple weeks, I and a full-time developer built a platform that originated thousands of loans. And we were getting feedback from our clients that was like, hey, we went to big bank XYZ and we couldn't even begin the process of submitting a loan application. So because we had that skill set internally, we were able to meet the needs of our customers. They were thrilled with the platform because we were able to put it together so quickly. So I would say it was $100 million of loans that we were able to originate, money that was able to get into the hands of small businesses that just wouldn't, it would have been very hard to do that otherwise.
Got it. Thanks,
Sorry,
David. Thank you very much. John, one final question to you. You're almost there. If somebody, and you did mention that 70% of businesses are already adopting some form of low-code platforms. What would be the caution points that you would flag to anybody who has not gotten into a scale mode of adopting low-code? Probably a couple of them that they need to keep in mind before they go full-fledged or dive deeper into adopting the platform.
Well, if you want to do citizen development, make sure it's a platform that's easy, right? And do the training and the boot camps and all that, both. So do both those levers. Sometimes people assume if it's low code, it means it's easy enough for anybody. That's not necessarily true. You can overcome stuff with training, but do both those things. And we already hit on the governance real hard, but I cannot overemphasize my point about digitizing it, treating it as its own digital problem. So don't just do like reviews by somebody on a spreadsheet or something. Like, as much as you can, automate the checks to ensure that stuff is safe and remove friction. So those risk factors have to be, their data somewhere, and you can automate around them somehow. You probably can. So do that, and don't wait for that. Do that up front. Build that foundation of people understanding that there's going to be hard guardrails they run into in the system, so you can, as you scale, and accept the fact that the role of IT is changing. It is changing, just like the personal computer, right? Like, no longer was computation done over here, but now anybody could compute, and that's like, whoa, that's a totally different job. That is exactly what this is, and that's exactly what's happening in the companies that are scaling it. But it's a good thing. It's a good thing.
Got it. Thank you very much. I had a bunch of other questions as well, but then we are on the top of the hour. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining in, for sharing your insights. And I'm sure it would be really, really helpful for our audience just to understand where all of this is going and what they should be doing in this larger scheme of things, right? And for everybody who has joined in, stay tuned for more, a lot more content, a lot more insights throughout the month of September as a part of our Developers Month celebration. So stay tuned for that. Once again, thank you very much, everyone. And it's a pleasure speaking to you, having you here and listening out to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Truman.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chairman.